Before that morning was over, the enemy would send back a single question. It contained Daniel Reed's real name and made Victor Hale realize he had chosen the wrong man as bait. Victor Hale chose Daniel Reed as bait because no one important was supposed to notice him. At 8:40 on a wet November morning, Daniel sat alone in a railway cafe with a brown government envelope beside his untouched tea, pretending not to know that 3 intelligence officers were watching him from across the concourse. He had been told the envelope contained forged shipping codes meant to tempt an enemy courier. What Victor had not told him was that the courier had already killed once to protect the channel. Daniel adjusted the envelope until its edge lined up perfectly with the table. He did that when he was nervous. He had been doing it for 6 straight minutes. "Stop touching it," Victor's voice murmured through the tiny receiver hidden beneath Daniel's collar. Daniel lowered his hand. It was crooked. A pause. Even through static, Victor somehow managed to sound unimpressed and attentive at the same time. "The enemy is unlikely to abandon the operation over your standards of stationary. That wasn't my concern." "I know." Daniel looked toward the arrivals board instead of the men Victor had warned him not to identify. The cafe smelled of burnt coffee and wet wool. Commuters moved around him without looking twice, which was precisely why Victor had selected him. Daniel was 28, thin, quiet, and employed in the cipher section where half the building forgot his name until they needed a transmission corrected before midnight. Useful men were remembered. Quiet men were used. He had learned to be comfortable somewhere between the two. A man in a gray coat entered the cafe at 8:47. Daniel knew he was wrong immediately, not because the man looked dangerous, because he never looked at the envelope. He looked at Daniel. Once. Briefly. Then he ordered coffee, placed 2 coins on the counter, and left through the eastern doors without collecting his change. "Gray coat," Daniel whispered. "He saw me." "He saw the table," Victor said. "No. Me." "Daniel." Victor's tone tightened by half a degree, which for him was the equivalent of another man raising his voice. "Stay seated." Daniel obeyed, though the back of his neck had gone cold. 30 seconds later, a young woman brushed past the table, dropped a folded newspaper beside his chair, and continued toward the platforms. One of Victor's watchers moved after her. The second remained near the ticket hall. The third vanished entirely. "That wasn't in the briefing," Daniel said. "Plans change. Briefings usually mention the parts where strangers leave objects at my feet." Victor did not answer immediately. That silence bothered Daniel more than the newspaper. He had worked under Victor Hale for 11 months. The chief rarely explained himself, but he also rarely needed time to choose his words. "Do not touch it," Victor said at last. Daniel stared at the paper. A strip of blue carbon copy protruded from the center fold. Cipher paper. Government issue. Not theirs. His pulse quickened, but the fear sharpened rather than blurred his attention. The exposed strip carried 6 typed groups, each 5 characters long. "Victor, I told you not to touch it." "I'm not touching it." "The third group is malformed." Another pause. "Malformed how?" Daniel leaned closer without moving his hands. "The spacing." Whoever typed it corrected the second character manually, but the carriage advanced twice. "That pattern appeared in traffic from Prague last month." This time Victor answered at once. "You're certain?" Daniel almost smiled despite himself. "You ask me that every time I tell you something you don't want to hear, and every time you become offended instead of answering." "I'm not offended. I'm precise." "Daniel." "Yes, I'm certain." The line went quiet. Then Victor ordered the team to terminate the contact plan. That was the first moment Daniel understood the operation had changed because of something he had seen. It was also the first moment he wondered how much Victor had expected him not to see. He was moved from the cafe within 4 minutes and taken through a service entrance into a secure communications annex beneath the station. Victor was waiting beside a teleprinter, coat still damp from the rain. In person, he seemed even more controlled than he sounded over the wire. "You recognize the typing pattern from memory?" "I corrected 3 transmissions with the same spacing error. They were classified above your review level." Daniel looked at him. "They were routed through my desk." Something unreadable crossed Victor's face. That should not have happened. Daniel's unease deepened. "Was I actually chosen because I'm a code clerk?" Victor met his eyes. "You were chosen because you were credible." It was a careful answer. Too careful. Before Daniel could press him, the teleprinter snapped alive. Both men turned. The machine hammered out an authenticated enemy response, 1 line at a time, black letters striking paper with mechanical calm. Victor stepped closer. Daniel stopped breathing when his own name appeared. Not his cover designation. Not the false identity printed in the bait documents. Daniel read. The message contained only one sentence. Victor read it once, then again, all color draining from the certainty he had carried into the room. Why did you choose the only clerk whose name we already knew? Daniel looked from the paper to the man who had put him on that cafe chair. For the first time since the operation began, Victor Hale had no order ready. Victor recovered first. He tore the teleprinter sheet free, folded it once, and handed it to a security officer without taking his eyes off Daniel. Seal the station. No outgoing calls. No courier traffic. No one leaves the communications wing until we know how that message was routed. Daniel stayed beside the machine, listening as the room changed around him. A minute earlier, he had been a clerk rescued from a compromised operation. Now 2 armed officers were standing near the only door, and one of them was watching him. Chief Hale, the older officer said, if the enemy knows Reed by name, he needs to be isolated. He is standing 3 feet from me. That is not what I meant. I know exactly what you meant. Victor's voice remained quiet, but the officer looked away first. Daniel should have felt grateful. Instead, the exchange sharpened something uncomfortable. Victor was protecting him from suspicion while still refusing to tell him what he had been protected from in the first place. A woman from internal security arrived 12 minutes later carrying a red access ledger and a portable tape recorder. She introduced herself as Margaret Shaw, closed the annex door, and placed the enemy message beneath a reading lamp. Only 5 people knew Reed would be at that cafe, she said. You, Chief Hale, 2 field supervisors, and me. The surveillance team received his identity after deployment. Daniel looked at Victor. 5. Victor did not answer immediately. Margaret did. 5 with the full operational brief. That phrasing landed harder than Daniel expected. Full operational brief. Not the version he had been given. Margaret turned the message over and pointed to a faint sequence printed beside the authentication stamp. This return channel should not exist outside headquarters. The Prague station does not have the current routing key. Daniel leaned closer. The number meant nothing to him at first, then something colder settled into place. That sequence was changed last Thursday. Margaret's eyes narrowed. How do you know? I typed the amendment. Victor looked at him. Your section handled that? My section handled the clerical distribution copy. We weren't told what the sequence controlled. Daniel kept his voice even. Apparently that was considered safer. The remark was mild enough to pass for professionalism. Victor heard the edge anyway. Daniel, I'm being precise. For the first time that morning, Margaret almost smiled. It disappeared when she opened the ledger. The routing amendment had been issued to 7 desks. 3 belonged to senior communications staff, 2 to operations, 1 to internal security, and 1 to Victor himself. The enemy had just used a detail available only inside that circle. The possibility that had seemed absurd in the railway cafe now sat on the table in black ink. Someone on their side had access to information the enemy should not possess. Margaret ordered a compartment review. Daniel expected to be sent upstairs. Instead, Victor told him to stay. If the message was meant to unsettle us, keeping him in the room rewards it, Margaret said. If the message refers to him by name, removing him from the analysis because it unsettles us would be worse, Victor replied. Daniel looked down at the ledger before either of them could notice how much that mattered. Being useful was familiar. Being defended because his observation might matter felt dangerously close to something else. He did not trust it yet. For the next hour, the work became quieter and more disturbing. They compared routing sheets, authorization stamps, courier logs, and the preparation record for the bait operation. Daniel noticed that Victor read everything from the top down, looking for authority and sequence. Daniel read from the margins inward. Corrections. Initials. Misaligned type. Things people considered too small to hide anything important. At 10:26, he found a discrepancy in the personnel access report. This timestamp is wrong. Margaret barely looked up. The system stamps automatically. Then the system is wrong. Victor moved beside him. Show me. Daniel pointed to the line containing his own file number. The entry showed his personnel record had been opened at 6:14 the previous morning under a general operations credential. The bait selection meeting was at 9, Daniel said. Yes. Victor's attention sharpened. You were not approved until after that meeting. Then why was someone looking at my file almost 3 hours before you chose me? Margaret pulled the original access tape from its envelope and threaded it through the reader. The machine clicked steadily as rows of tiny marks passed beneath the glass. The timestamp matched. No clerical error. No duplicate entry. Someone with operations-level access had opened Daniel Reed's full personnel record before Victor Hale had formally selected him for an operation that was supposed to make him visible to the enemy for the first time. Victor went very still. Daniel watched him study the tape and understood that the question from the teleprinter had changed again. The enemy knowing his name was no longer the most troubling fact. Someone inside their own building had been interested in Daniel before Victor ever decided to use him. At 10:41, the archive clerk returned with Daniel's correction file and an apology. 3 pages were missing. Missing how? Margaret Shaw said. The clerk swallowed. Removed from the carbon set. Cleanly. Not misfiled. Victor looked at Daniel, then at the thin folder on the table. Someone had opened Daniel's personnel record before the bait operation, and now someone had reached backward into his work history. The interest was no longer theoretical. It had left fingerprints. Daniel pulled the remaining pages toward him. These aren't the important ones. Margaret frowned. How can you tell? Because I remember the mistakes. He began sorting the copies by date, aligning their corners without noticing he was doing it. Most were routine. Transposed digits, doubled characters, broken spacing, the small errors that accumulated when exhausted operators worked through long nights. Then Daniel stopped. This one. Victor moved closer. What about it? The third group. Daniel tapped a line from a Prague relay dated 6 weeks earlier. Same double carriage advance as the paper at the cafe. Margaret leaned over his shoulder. That could be a machine fault. It could. Daniel reached for another sheet. Except this one came through Vienna 4 days later. The same spacing anomaly appeared again. Then another from a shipping desk in Brussels. Different stations. Different operators. Different machines. The error was identical. Victor's expression changed before Margaret's did. That isn't a mechanical failure. No, Daniel said. It's a habit. For the first time that morning, his fear gave way to something cleaner. Familiar. Work. He could breathe inside work. He pulled more pages from the folder and began building a sequence across the table. Victor asked no questions while Daniel sorted. He simply watched, which Daniel found unexpectedly helpful. Most senior officers became impatient when clerical detail did not become meaning quickly enough. Victor waited. 5 minutes later, Daniel circled 4 entries. These transmissions were all corrected by me. Only you? Margaret asked. No. Other clerks handled the originals. I caught the same spacing irregularity after distribution and sent amendment slips. Victor studied the dates. And every time you corrected one, what happened next? Daniel hesitated. He had never considered the corrections as a chain. The next occurrence changed format. Margaret went still. Daniel saw it too. After his first amendment, the error shifted from the third group to the fifth. After the second, the doubled carriage became a shortened gap. After the third, the anomaly disappeared from spacing entirely and reappeared in transmission timing. Someone had adjusted. Not randomly. In response. They were testing whether anyone noticed, Victor said. Daniel shook his head slowly. No. They already knew someone noticed. His finger rested on the 4th entry. They were testing how I noticed. Silence settled over the table, but this time it carried shape. Daniel was no longer looking at a collection of clerical mistakes. He was looking at a conversation he had never known he was part of. Every correction he filed had told someone outside his section what kind of pattern he could see. Margaret crossed to the telephone and ordered the missing pages traced through document control. Before she finished, Victor reached for one of the sheets Daniel had marked. You said these were dismissed. Mostly. By whom? Daniel glanced at the distribution initials. Section supervisors. Sometimes operations review. Usually no one replied. And you kept correcting them. That was my job. Victor looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Most people stop when no one listens. Daniel gave a small shrug. Errors don't become correct because senior officers get bored. Victor's mouth almost moved. I'll try to remember that. It was the closest thing to humor the room could support, and Daniel hated that he noticed. Margaret returned to the table with a fresh concern. Document control had found the missing pages logged out under a temporary research authorization issued 3 days ago. The authorization number was valid, but the signature attached to it belonged to an officer who had been in Geneva all week. Forgery, Daniel said. Or borrowed authority, Victor replied. The distinction mattered. Whoever was watching Daniel did not merely have access to records. They understood the procedures well enough to move through them without attracting attention. Victor immediately ordered Daniel's correction history sealed and transferred to a compartment only 3 people could access. That makes me sound important, Daniel said before he could stop himself. Victor's eyes met his. At the moment, that makes you vulnerable. The words landed differently from the praise Daniel had expected. Not softer, more honest. Daniel looked back at the papers and realized something else. The oldest anomaly on the table was dated 7 weeks before the railway operation. His first correction had been filed the next morning. The second anomaly appeared 48 hours later, altered just enough to test him. Someone had begun adapting to Daniel Reed long before Victor Hale ever decided he was harmless enough to use as bait. And whoever had removed those 3 pages now knew that Daniel had started putting the pattern together. By noon, Daniel's security badge no longer opened the cipher room door. He discovered it when the red light flashed beneath his hand, and an armed officer stepped between him and the corridor he had walked every morning for 11 months. Temporary restriction, Margaret Shaw said from behind him, until we establish whether the enemy's interest in you involved contact. Daniel turned slowly. Contact. They knew your name. Your work appears in traffic they were monitoring. Internal security has procedures. Yesterday, I was trusted with classified transmissions. Yesterday, the enemy hadn't sent a message about you. The officer held out his hand for Daniel's badge. Daniel surrendered it. Across the corridor, Victor watched without intervening. That hurt more than Daniel expected. Margaret moved the investigation into a sealed conference room and placed Daniel at the far end of the table, away from the files, until she authorized each one. His correction history had made him important enough to protect and suspicious enough to restrict in the same morning. Useful when needed. Dangerous when inconvenient. The distinction felt horribly familiar. There is one document you should see, Margaret said. Victor's attention sharpened. Not yet. Daniel looked at him. You don't get to decide what I see anymore. The room went quiet. Victor's jaw tightened, but he did not contradict him. Margaret opened a gray operations folder and slid a risk assessment across the table. Daniel recognized his own personnel photograph in the corner. Beneath it were words written in the cool language of operational planning. Low public profile, minimal external attachments, limited political sensitivity, low probability of hostile recognition. Then one line stopped him. Acceptable exposure in controlled contact environment. Daniel read it twice. Exposure. Victor remained standing. Daniel, does that mean what it sounds like? It means the planners believe the risk could be contained. That isn't what I asked. Daniel tapped the page with one finger. Did you know I could be recognized? Victor's silence gave him part of the answer before the words came. We knew there was a possibility the contact might identify you as government personnel. Daniel felt something inside him settle rather than break. The anger was quieter than fear and far easier to use. And the man in the gray coat. Victor's gaze shifted briefly toward Margaret. Daniel caught it. What about him? You told me he was a courier. He was believed to be. Was he dangerous? Victor did not reach for operational language this time. Yes. Daniel's hand withdrew from the document. How dangerous? He was linked to the death of an informant in Rotterdam. Margaret looked down. Daniel stared at Victor. The cafe returned in one hard detail. The crooked envelope beneath his fingertips, Victor telling him to stay seated while the man in gray looked directly at him. You knew that before you put me there. Yes. Victor's answer was immediate now. No excuse. Somehow that made it worse. Daniel pushed back from the table. I want out of this investigation. Margaret glanced toward Victor, expecting an order. Victor could have given one. Daniel saw the decision pass across his face. Reed remains available for questioning, Margaret said carefully. His analytical work is now central too. He said he wants out. Victor cut in. Daniel looked at him, surprised despite himself. Victor continued. You can restrict his clearance if you believe procedure requires it. You will not compel his analytical cooperation on my authority. It was the first thing Victor had done all day that cost him something. It did not repair the damage. Daniel refused to let it. Margaret closed the folder with visible irritation. Then we proceed without him. An hour later, proceeding without Daniel produced another problem. Margaret returned carrying the original personnel profile used during the bait selection meeting and an earlier carbon copy from record storage. She placed them side by side. You need to see this before you leave. Daniel almost refused. Then he noticed the difference. The older copy described him as meticulous, unusually persistent with transmission anomalies, and likely to escalate unresolved discrepancies despite senior dismissal. In the version Victor had reviewed before choosing him, those lines were gone. In their place, compliant, low initiative, unlikely to deviate from assigned procedure. Daniel read the altered description once, then looked at Victor. That isn't me. I know, Victor said. Margaret pointed to the amendment stamp. The change was entered 48 hours before the bait selection meeting. Daniel felt the room narrow around the page. Someone had not merely opened his file. Someone had rewritten the exact traits Victor used to decide he would be safe, predictable, and disposable enough for the operation. Victor stared at the two profiles as if they were an accusation aimed at him personally. Who authorized the amendment? Margaret's expression hardened. That's the problem. The authorization traces to operations review. Victor's department. His chain of command. Daniel looked again at the erased description of himself. The version that said he noticed things, persisted, and refused to leave errors alone. Someone inside the service had known exactly what kind of clerk Daniel Reed really was. Then they had made sure Victor Hale saw someone else. Margaret did not leave the two personnel profiles on the table. She carried them to records control herself, and Victor took Daniel with her. Not because Daniel had agreed to rejoin the investigation, but because the amendment stamp on the false profile had produced one detail none of them could explain. The authorization code belonged to an operations review terminal that had been decommissioned 9 months earlier. The machine should not have existed. Yet someone had used it 48 hours before Victor selected Daniel as bait. By 3, records control had reconstructed the old terminal activity. Victor remained beside him, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but not close enough to mistake proximity for forgiveness. There, Daniel said. A routing number flashed past. Margaret stopped the reel. The false amendment had not originated from the dead terminal at all. The code had been copied onto the record after transmission, disguising the actual source. Daniel asked for the previous entry. 11 seconds earlier, a live operations identifier appeared. Victor recognized it first. His face changed. That is dispatch coordination. Margaret looked at him. Your dispatch coordination. Victor said nothing. Daniel watched the silence form between them. The bait proposal, personnel shortlist, and surveillance schedule had all passed through that office. Someone had been close enough to shape the path by which Victor found Daniel. Margaret ordered the original bait selection packet brought down. Daniel almost stepped back when she opened it. 3 clerks had been considered. 2 had been rejected for reasons that suddenly looked too convenient. One had a visible family connection to a senior diplomat. Another had recently filed for medical leave. Daniel's altered profile made him the cleanest remaining option. Quiet, compliant, unlikely to deviate. Victor stared at the shortlist. I thought I was choosing the least exposed person. Daniel's voice came out flatter than he intended. You were choosing the person someone wanted exposed. Victor met his eyes. He could have reached for that sentence like a defense. He did not. Yes. The answer changed something, but not enough. Daniel folded his arms. That does not make what you did disappear. No, Victor looked back at the risk assessment. It explains how I was steered. It does not excuse the decision I made after I was steered. Margaret's gaze moved briefly between them, then returned to the documents. Daniel still did not trust him, but the shape of the betrayal had changed. Victor had used him. Someone else had designed the conditions that made him look usable. The technician called them back to the reader. He had found another connection. The dispatch identifier appeared 3 times in the 6 weeks before the bait operation, each occurrence within hours of one of Daniel's correction reports. Daniel felt the pieces lock into place before anyone spoke. They were watching the corrections. Margaret nodded slowly. From inside operations. The dates matched Prague, Vienna, and Brussels. Each time Daniel noticed the hidden pattern, someone inside Victor's command chain checked his work file or personnel record. Victor looked at the sequence and said, The enemy did not discover you at the railway station. Daniel already knew. The message from the teleprinter had sounded like a threat when he first read it. Now it looked almost like confirmation. Why did you choose the only clerk whose name we already knew? The enemy had known his name because Daniel had been disturbing their system for weeks without realizing it. His small corrections had forced someone to adapt. His persistence had made him visible long before Victor's operation. They weren't studying me because I was bait, Daniel said. I became bait because they were already studying me. Margaret pulled the Prague, Vienna, and Brussels records together. Beneath the differences in formatting, one pattern remained consistent. The irregular transmissions always crossed an authorization layer available only to a narrow group within operations review and dispatch coordination. Victor's department. His people. His trust structure. The conflict was no longer about how the enemy had learned Daniel's name. That question had an answer now. The harder problem was who inside headquarters had noticed Daniel getting close to the leak, rewritten his profile, and maneuvered Victor into placing him directly in hostile view. Victor gathered the records into a single file. We stopped looking outward. Daniel watched him. And do what? Victor did not give an order. Find the person in my command who needed you exposed before you understood what you were seeing. Daniel looked at the correction sheets, then at the altered profile that had nearly turned his quietness into a death sentence. He had wanted out an hour ago. He still wanted the right to leave. But now the mystery belonged partly to him. Someone had been answering his work in secret, changing tactics every time he noticed too much. For the first time, Daniel understood that the pattern was not simply evidence of a leak. It was evidence that the leak had been watching him back. By 4 o'clock, Victor's entire operations floor was under internal lockdown, and Daniel was still carrying a security badge that opened nothing. Margaret Shaw sealed the relevant archives and told Victor that any further disclosure to Daniel required internal security approval. Victor listened, then closed the office door behind her. Daniel remained standing beside the conference table. "I meant what I said earlier," he told him. "I'm not going back into this because you need me." Victor set the file from records control on the table, but did not slide it across. "Then don't." Daniel had prepared himself for persuasion. The absence of it unsettled him more. "That's simple." "No." Victor looked tired for the first time Daniel could remember. "Nothing about this is simple. But if you continue, you do it knowing what I know." Daniel studied him. "Everything relevant. Everything relevant. No operational version written for my protection." Victor's mouth tightened slightly. "No. If the risk changes, I hear it before you decide whether I can handle it." "Yes." Daniel straightened a stack of blank paper until every edge matched. Victor noticed. He said nothing. "And I can stop. At any point." Daniel finally looked up. "Even if you think stopping ruins the operation?" Victor held his gaze. "Even then." That answer cost something. Daniel could hear it in how carefully Victor delivered it. He sat down. "Then show me the file." Victor pushed it across. "Internal security will consider this an unauthorized disclosure." "Will they arrest you?" "Probably not." That sounded almost optimistic. "I'm experimenting." Daniel looked down before Victor could see the small, unwilling smile. The moment lasted only seconds. The first page ended it. Daniel compared the original dispatch transmissions against the archived versions. They did not match. A routing mark shifted by 1 position, a timing entry by 17 seconds, an authorization code by another with the same clearance. Each change was small enough to survive routine audit. Together they showed something worse than leaked copies. Someone inside operations could rewrite the historical record after a transmission had already moved through the system. "This isn't just interception," Daniel said. Victor leaned over the table without touching the papers. "They're editing the trail. Which means every search we've run through the archive may have been searching a version they wanted us to see." Victor's expression hardened. Their investigation had depended on records the mole could alter. Daniel compared the access lists and narrowed the people capable of both routing and archival amendment from dozens to 5. Victor recognized every name. Some were officers he had trusted for years. Daniel saw the change in his face. "You trust them?" "I did." "That isn't the same thing." Victor looked at him. "No, it isn't." Daniel returned to the records. Today, trust had become measurable by what someone allowed another person to know when the truth made life harder. 40 minutes later, Margaret entered without knocking and stopped at the open files. "You gave him compartmented dispatch records." "I did," Victor said. "That does not give you authority to ignore protocol." Victor's voice stayed level. "Then record the violation under my name." He did not look toward Daniel for approval. That mattered more than if he had. Margaret collected herself. "You've narrowed the access group?" Daniel answered before Victor could. 5 people could make the changes without borrowing credentials. More if the credentials were borrowed. Margaret placed a new audit sheet on the table. "Then you have another problem." Daniel recognized his personnel number immediately. According to the log, his credentials had accessed the restricted archive at 2:18 that afternoon and altered one of the same dispatch records they were investigating. Daniel stared at the timestamp. At 2:18, he had been downstairs in records control with Victor, Margaret, and 2 technicians. "That's impossible." Margaret's face was grim. "Which helps us." "For now." Victor picked up the sheet. "Where was the access made?" "Cipher Annex 2. Daniel's stomach tightened. That was his normal section. The room his badge had stopped opening at noon. Someone had used his credentials after internal security locked him out of the building systems. The strategy had changed again. Whoever was inside operations was no longer merely hiding the leak or steering Victor's decisions. They were beginning to build a record in which Daniel Reed was the person altering the archive. Victor set the sheet down carefully. From this point forward, nothing under Daniel's name can be treated as authentic without independent verification. Daniel looked at the false access entry, then at the 5 names remaining on their list. Leaving the investigation would no longer return him to safety. Someone had already started constructing a version of events in which he was the traitor. He pulled the files closer. Then we stopped trying to prove who had access, he said. We find the person who can change what access means. Victor nodded once. No order followed. This time, the objective belonged to Daniel too. Internal security came for Daniel before he and Victor could finish comparing the 5 remaining names. 2 officers entered the conference room with Margaret Shaw behind them, carrying a sealed evidence packet and an order signed by the deputy director. Daniel's badge had already been confiscated. Now the order suspended his clearance entirely and authorized his detention inside headquarters until the compromise review was complete. This happened 20 minutes ago, Margaret said, placing the packet on the table. Inside was a carbon copy of an outgoing transmission routed through Daniel's credentials. It contained 3 archive references, 2 authentic enemy identifiers, and enough restricted material to make him look less like a framed clerk and more like someone feeding the other side. Daniel stared at the page. I never sent this. I know where you were, Margaret said. That does not solve the problem. The record says you did. One of the officers moved toward Daniel. Victor stepped between them. He stays here. You no longer have authority over the review, Margaret said quietly. The deputy director has ordered Reed isolated, and you have been instructed to recuse yourself. Victor's face did not change. On what grounds? Margaret looked at the open compartment files. Unauthorized disclosure. Failure to report a compromised subordinate. Obstruction of internal security procedure. Daniel felt the room tilt in a way danger had not managed at the railway station. The mole was no longer hiding a trail. Someone was writing an official version of events fast enough that the institution might accept it before Daniel could prove anything else. Victor had warned him that records could be edited. Now those records were beginning to decide who he was. Daniel reached for the forged transmission before Margaret could stop him. The first line looked clean. So did the second. On the third, his eyes caught a timing notation that had been rounded forward by 17 seconds. He looked closer. Another routing mark sat one position too far left. The same microscopic irregularities he had traced from Prague to Vienna to Brussels were embedded inside the evidence against him. They made a mistake. Margaret leaned over the page. Where? Daniel pointed. Here. And here. Whoever built this copied the archive style they've been using for weeks. Victor understood immediately. The fingerprint. Daniel nodded. They're trying to frame me with the same habits that made me notice them. It was the closest they had come to proof, but not close enough. A pattern could challenge the transmission. It could not yet identify the person who created it. Margaret's expression tightened. If we present this now, they'll call it interpretation. Then give us time, Victor said. I don't control that anymore. She lowered her voice. You were offered a way out, Victor. Sign the recusal, state that Reed exceeded his duties without authorization, and the inquiry into your conduct becomes administrative. Daniel looked at him. The offer was brutally simple. Victor could preserve his career by allowing the official story to place the contamination around Daniel. It was exactly the kind of decision Victor had once considered reasonable. Contain one person to protect the larger structure. Victor took the recusal form, read it, and tore it once down the middle. Put the obstruction under my name too. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. That will not protect him. I know. The answer silenced the room. Daniel felt no sudden forgiveness. What he felt was worse in some ways. Evidence that Victor was changing when change finally cost him something. The officers were ordered to wait outside, while Margaret requested a temporary delay. Daniel sat down again, but his hands would not stay still. He aligned the forged transmission with the table edge, then corrected it twice more. Victor watched him. You do that when you're angry. Daniel stopped. I do it when things are out of order. Today those may be the same thing. There was no humor in it. Daniel looked at the man who had once told him to stay seated while the killer walked through the cafe. You knew that man could kill me, and you still sent me. Victor did not look away. Yes. Daniel's throat tightened. Because I was acceptable exposure. Victor's voice dropped. Because I convinced myself that controlling the operation meant I had the right to decide which risks other people could carry. No justification came. I was wrong. The words did not heal anything. They did, however, remove the last place Victor could hide. Daniel looked down at the forged transmission again. If the mole could alter records under his name, any passive investigation would end with Daniel buried beneath evidence manufactured faster than he could disprove it. They needed a reaction the mole could not edit afterward. Daniel traced the familiar timing error with one finger. The pattern had changed whenever he corrected it. Someone had been watching his work closely enough to adapt. That meant they could be made to adapt again. If I recreate the signature deliberately, Daniel said, but alter one detail only the real source would recognize, they'll have to decide whether I've finally understood the leak. Victor's expression hardened. You would make yourself visible again. I already am. Daniel. No, Daniel met his eyes. His voice was quiet, but it did not shake. The first time, you decided I was bait. This time, I'm deciding whether I am. Victor said nothing. Daniel pulled the forged transmission closer and began marking the pattern that had nearly destroyed him. By the time Margaret returned with news that Daniel's detention order would take effect at midnight, he had already chosen the only strategy that could force the hidden officer to stop rewriting the past and make a mistake in the present. At 10:18 that night, Daniel placed 5 nearly identical transmissions on the cipher room table and told Victor Hale exactly how he intended to become bait. Each message contained the same false discovery. Daniel had supposedly identified the original source of the altered archive traffic and would submit proof before midnight. Only one detail changed between copies, a harmless routing reference buried inside the timing pattern. Each of the 5 remaining suspects would receive a different version. If one of them warned the enemy network, the returning signal would identify which copy had leaked. Victor read all 5 without touching them. There is a safer version. Daniel knew what he meant. Send one message without telling Daniel which variation was real. Make his reactions impossible to read, even under surveillance. 2 days ago, Victor would have done it without asking. Would I know which message you actually sent? Daniel said. No, Victor held his gaze. Then he gathered that version of the plan and tore it in half. Then we don't use it. The choice mattered more than Daniel wanted it to. Victor gave him the remaining risks without softening them. The mole could recognize the trap. Internal security might detain Daniel before a response arrived. If the enemy believed Daniel truly understood the leak, someone might try to silence him before midnight. You can stop now, Victor said. The order becomes active in less than 2 hours. I can still put you somewhere secure. Daniel looked at the 5 transmissions. The first time Victor had placed him in danger, Daniel had known almost nothing. This time he knew exactly what could happen. Send them. Victor did not move. That is your decision? Yes. Only then did Victor call Margaret Shaw. By 10:46, the 5 messages had entered 5 separate controlled channels under Daniel's credentials. Margaret monitored internal security traffic from the adjoining room while Victor stayed beside the radio desk. Daniel watched the clock and listened to the low hiss of intercepted signals. For 20 minutes, nothing changed. Then one channel moved. Not officially. A routing relay associated with the 3rd message opened for 4 seconds, closed, and reopened through an archival pathway that should have been dormant. Daniel leaned over the printout. 3rd copy. Victor checked the distribution sheet. The 3rd version had gone to Martin Keene, deputy head of dispatch coordination, a man Victor had worked with for 12 years. Margaret's voice came over the desk phone. Keene just left his office. He bypassed the main corridor. Daniel looked at the timing marks appearing beneath the intercept. 17 seconds rounded forward. Routing mark displaced 1 position. The same fingerprint. This time it was happening live. Not in a record someone could rewrite tomorrow. Record everything, Daniel said. Victor was already reaching for the security switch, then stopped. Your operation. Daniel understood what he was giving back. Control. Keep the exits open for another 30 seconds. If Keene thinks he's trapped, he'll destroy the channel before we know where it leads. Victor withdrew his hand. 30 seconds. At 23, the cipher room door opened. Martin Keene stepped inside. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, composed, and carrying the same expression senior officers used when they expected junior staff to move aside. His eyes went first to Daniel, then to the live printer. You should be in detention. Daniel remained seated. Not until midnight. Keene glanced at Victor. You're letting a compromised clerk run an operation now. Victor said nothing. Daniel did. You changed the pattern every time I corrected it. Keene's face barely moved. That was enough. Prague was spacing. Vienna was carriage position. Brussels was timing. I thought I was fixing different mistakes. Daniel turned the latest intercept toward him. You were learning what I could see. Keene looked at the paper, and for the first time his composure cracked. His hand moved toward his coat. Victor shifted instantly, but Daniel was already pressing the transmission key. The false routing reference from Keene's copy went out across the live channel. The enemy relay answered almost immediately with a cancellation code tied to the same hidden pathway. Margaret's officers entered before Keene could reach the door. He stared at Daniel as they took his weapon. You have no idea what you've exposed. Daniel's voice stayed quiet. That used to frighten me. He looked at the live record still printing behind Keene. Now I know exactly what I exposed. The proof could no longer be reduced to altered archives or borrowed credentials. Keene had reacted to information only he had received, used the hidden route Daniel had mapped, and triggered an authenticated enemy response while internal security recorded the entire chain. The conflict was decided in the present, where no one could rewrite it afterward. When the room finally emptied, Victor remained near the door instead of approaching Daniel. "You were right," he said. Daniel looked at the 5 messages, then at the torn version Victor had refused to use. "About the pattern? About the choice?" Victor's voice was lower now. "It had to be yours." Daniel did not answer immediately. The mole was exposed. The enemy channel was compromised. His name could be cleared. But none of that erased the railway cafe or the fact that Victor had once believed Daniel's life was a risk he had the right to assign. What had changed was simpler and harder to dismiss. When the decisive moment came, Victor had possessed the power to control him again, and had chosen not to use it. By 9 the next morning, Martin Keene was in internal security custody. The hidden relay he had used was under British control, and Daniel Reed's detention order had been cancelled before anyone could execute it. The live intercept from the cipher room had done what weeks of altered records could not. It showed Keene receiving Daniel's private variation, opening the concealed channel, and triggering an authenticated enemy response in real time. There was nothing left for the archive to rewrite. There was one final answer in the relay traffic seized overnight. The question sent at the railway station had not been a taunt but a panic check from Keene's foreign handler. They knew Daniel only as the clerk whose corrections kept forcing them to adapt, and Keene had never told them he was steering Victor toward Daniel. When Daniel appeared as bait, they feared British intelligence had identified the leak and deliberately placed the one clerk already tracking their pattern in front of them. Margaret Shaw returned Daniel's badge personally, though its clearance remained temporarily limited while the review worked backward through every transmission Keene had touched. "Your record will be corrected," she said. "All of it." Daniel turned the badge over in his palm. 2 days earlier, losing it had made him feel as if the institution had taken away proof that he belonged there. Now it seemed like a much smaller object. "And Chief Hale." Margaret glanced through the glass wall toward Victor's office. "Formal censure. Suspension of operational command pending review. The unauthorized disclosure alone would have been enough." She paused. "His original decision to use you is also being examined." Daniel appreciated that she did not call the outcome unfair. Victor had helped expose Keene, but success did not erase what came before it. "He knew that would happen," Daniel said. "Yes." Margaret's expression softened by a degree. "He signed the statement himself." Daniel found Victor an hour later in the same conference room where he had first seen the words "acceptable exposure" beside his photograph. Most of the classified files were gone. Only one thin folder remained on the table, along with a cup of coffee Victor had predictably forgotten to drink. Victor stood when Daniel entered, then seemed to reconsider the gesture. "Your clearance? Restricted, but restored." "Good." Daniel looked at the folder. "What's that?" Victor pushed it toward him and stopped before it crossed the midpoint of the table. "Everything concerning your selection for the railway operation. The original shortlist, the altered profile, my authorization, Keene's changes, and my statement to the review board." Daniel did not reach for it immediately. "Am I cleared to read all of that?" "No. That seems to be becoming a habit. A costly one." There was the faintest edge of dry humor in Victor's voice, but he did not smile. "You should still have it." Daniel opened the folder. No missing pages. No sanitized summary. No version designed to protect Victor from what Daniel might think. Near the back was the risk assessment with Victor's signature beneath the line that had hurt most. "Acceptable exposure in controlled contact environment." Beside it, in Victor's review statement, was a plain admission. The risk had been known. Daniel had not been told enough to consent to it, and operational necessity did not make that decision morally neutral. Daniel read the paragraph twice. "You didn't have to write it this way." "Yes, I did." "You could have blamed Keene. Keene manipulated the selection." Victor's gaze stayed on the folder. "He did not put my signature there." The answer hurt less than it once would have, perhaps because Victor was no longer trying to remove the pain from it. Daniel closed the file. "I'm still angry with you." "I know. I may be angry with you for a long time." "I know that too." No defense followed. No request for forgiveness. Victor simply waited, and Daniel understood how different that waiting was from the silence at the railway station. Back then, Victor had withheld information because he believed he alone could judge what Daniel needed to know. Now he was leaving space because the next decision was not his. "Internal security offered me a transfer," Daniel said. Victor's expression remained controlled, but his attention sharpened. Away from operations? A permanent analytical post. Better clearance. Better pay. Fewer men trying to get me killed before breakfast. That sounds sensible. Daniel almost laughed. You're terrible at this. At what? Wanting something and not turning it into an instruction. Victor looked down at his cold coffee. I'm learning. Daniel noticed that the stack of papers near Victor's elbow was crooked. His hand moved automatically, then stopped. For once, nothing terrible would happen if the edges stayed out of line. I haven't accepted the transfer, he said. Victor looked back at him. Why not? Daniel took his time. Because I want to finish reviewing the compromised traffic. Because I'm good at it. Because I'm tired of pretending being quiet means I should stay where other people put me. Victor said nothing. Daniel continued. And because whatever happens between us next, I don't want it happening because you're my chief. Something in Victor's face finally gave way. Not dramatically, just enough to make him look less like the man who could control an entire operations floor and more like the man who had spent 2 days learning that control had limits. I may not be your chief much longer. That might help. This time Victor did smile, briefly. Daniel reached for the untouched coffee, carried it to the sideboard, and replaced it with a fresh cup from the pot. It was such a small act that neither of them needed to name it. When he returned, Victor had placed a single sheet on top of the folder. It was the final corrected intelligence record. Keen identified, Daniel cleared, the hidden channel documented, the original anomalies credited to Daniel's correction work. One clean-typed line near the bottom carried Daniel Reed's name not as a suspect, not as bait, and not as an acceptable loss, but as the analyst whose persistence had exposed the breach. Daniel read it, then set the page down without straightening it. Victor glanced at the uneven edge and noticed. Of course he did. Daniel. Yes. Victor paused. There was no assignment waiting, no classified detail withheld behind his eyes. Would you stay for coffee? Daniel looked at the fresh cup between them. That isn't an order? No, for the first time. Victor Hale had no order ready, and Daniel stayed anyway.